In this presentation, I would like to take a look at how to rebuild the carburetor for your Honda GC series engine. Before we get started, it's important to note that the variations of the carburetor are quite numerous, almost as much as the piston and the piston rings. This carburetor is one of the components on this engine that has changed actually quite a bit. So make sure to point out the reference number, or the serial number, if you will, on the carburetor, the BB series, if you will, when you're ordering parts for your carburetor or when you're obtaining a replacement unit. So typically I will replace this carburetor. If I take it apart, try to clean it, don't have any luck, or I have minimal luck, it's a fairly cheap component to replace. So we're going to go ahead and point out some of the differences throughout the generations of this carburetor and show you what is inside. So as always, before we get into this demonstration, I would like to review a couple of expectations. A rebuild lab sheet has been provided, both paper and a reference link to that, along with this video on Google Classroom. A series of instructor checks are required and questions that need to be answered as well to get your full points on this lab sheet. So make sure you're being attentive on that. Don't just simply take the carburetor apart, put it all back together, and then hand the sheet in with nothing written on it. So that is very much part of your hands-on, your practical lab grade as well. So also the gaskets that we talked about in the previous presentation, with the insulator, the square insulator, and then the other series of gaskets that went along with it. You will need to recreate those in AutoCAD, as removing the carburetor obviously damages the gasket. They're really not a multiple or repeat use type of product. They're single use only. Those will be future assignments in Infinite Campus. So without further ado, let's take a look at this carburetor. So let's jump into this carburetor. First thing we're going to do on one of the differences on the newer style of carburetors, they lack a drain bolt. So we're going to lefty-loosey, and we're going to remove the float bolt. It's important to notice that there is a seal, a red, kind of a fiber seal underneath this bolt. Without it, the carburetor will leak fuel. So we'll just set that aside. It is the only bolt like it on this engine. Sometimes you need a little tap gently to loosen the float bowl up. The float bowl shouldn't have any goos or any contamination, any chunks of anything in it. So obviously this one being brand new, it doesn't have any of that. If the float bowl itself is leaking, if you have a fuel leak from this area here, you need to replace this paper gasket. So as a student, please do not try to dig that piece out. You have about an 87% chance of ruining it when you're making that attempt. So the next thing that I need you to do is we're simply going to push this float pin right here out and then grab it with our two fingers. We'll set it, I'm just going to put it in the float bowl for the time being. We can then remove the float, and you saw the float valve fall out. So we'll detail a little bit later exactly how that is reinstalled into the carburetor. So taking a look here at the float, we want to make sure that there are no cracks or any fuel ingress or anything like that in the float itself. You can accomplish that simply by shaking it and listening if there's any sloshing. If there's sloshing, you might replace the float or maybe perhaps the entire carburetor. If you have fuel running out of the intake of the carburetor, the float valve is not shutting off. There are two causes of that. One, that your float is sinking, in other words, that it doesn't float any longer, or two, that this needle valve either has junk stuck in it or the neoprene tip has become damaged. So if you have no fuel in your float bowl after you've taken your carburetor apart, most often that is from improper installation of the float valve into the float. So you notice how the float valve actually locks into the float here, if you will. Very important that it is actually installed that way. If it's not, and you install it with it setting up on top, kind of like that, it will never be able to allow any fuel to flow into the carburetor. So we're simply going to set the float and the float valve off camera there a little bit so that we can concentrate here on the carburetor. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a slotted screwdriver and we're going to remove the main jet. And if you look down inside the carburetor, Honda is kind of unique in this setup, and so are some of the Honda clones as far as this jet setup. So if you're changing your jet setup for altitude or something of the sort, this is actually the piece that you are going to change. So generators and things like that. There is also a hole in the side here. I install that float pin and I put a good amount of pressure on that, and then I can continue to unscrew the main jet. If you don't do that, it's actually very difficult to remove the main jet from the carburetor. Now you saw how that moved in, and you saw how we can remove the main jet from the carburetor. We want to check and make sure that that little hole, in the end of that jet that goes through it is clean, that there's no debris inside of it. Next up, sometimes a tap will dislodge it, but I am going to go down the throat of the carburetor. We're going to remove the, I call it the emulsion tube. I think Honda calls it, it's part of the jet. I'm forgetting the actual name that Honda calls it. But if this thing is cemented in, the air cannot mix with the fuel. The fuel delivery will not be correct through this tube. So this is where the high-speed fuel is actually delivered into the carburetor. This is not part of the low-speed jet. Well, I suppose it kind of is, with a little technical for what we're actually doing here, so I digress. But anyway, I'm asking you on the lab sheet to count the total number of holes that you have on this. If it is clogged, I usually take a welding tip cleaner and I can clean most of this stuff out. A very fine, piece of copper wire or something like that may fit in here. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to replace the carburetor if that has too much junk in it. Looking inside the choke end here of the carburetor, this is an air vent, okay? And that lines up with this hole right here, and that vents the float bowl all of the time, okay? Then what you have on this side here, you notice there's a blank, okay? That there's a blank where it looks like something could be drilled. And on some models of carburetor, there's a low-speed fuel mixture adjustment provided, and obviously this little wing here limits the travel on that. Just depends. Underneath the Phillips screw, I may or may not be able to remove that. Looks like we're having luck. Is the low-speed jet assembly. So I can't flush out anything here in the air bleed setup, unfortunately, on this, so that's kind of at where it's at. I can usually flow, carburetor cleaner backwards, which ends up coming into the area where we remove the emulsion tube if there's any dirt stuck into that. There is a BB, brass pressed into this hole Honda drilled, because you can really only drill straight. And then there is a progressive jet setup here. Kind of hard to see. Little holes here for the low speed fuel mixture. So I usually bend the straw of my can of carburetor cleaner and I can flow product backwards. It will come out of this jet. You can also kind of see the structure on how they set up the low speed jet on this carburetor. Again, this is not necessarily a presentation on how the carburetor works, more specifically what I do to clean it. And this honestly is as far apart as you can take this carburetor. You can, I suppose, optionally remove this Welch plug over here, but you're going to need to purchase a new one. And that will get you into the sides where they drilled those like 5 holes or so for that progressive low-speed jet. If you need to order parts for your carburetor or to replace it, located right here is the serial number of the carburetor. And of course, they're all the BB series of carburetors. Your carburetor may have a screw installed in this location right here, and that would be for the minimum idle speed for your carburetor. This one does not support it because it is a fixed RPM engine. It never idles, so you would not need an idle speed adjustment here on a carburetor like this, because it would be, really, it's pointless. It would never ever come into play. So let's go ahead and reinstall all of the components into this carburetor. We're going to take what I call the emulsion tube, and we're going to insert it with the long end facing the carburetor. So the long end goes into the carburetor first. And then we're going to make sure that that is pressed all the way into the body of the carburetor. We're then going to install our main jet. We're simply going to thread down. We really don't want to cross thread anything. It's all brass. We have to be super careful. That's going to drop down. You have to be careful on the second round of threads not to cross thread anything. We're just going to give that just a slight little oomph to torque it down. We'll look inside of the carburetor bore, and we want to be able to see that little brass end of that jet kind of poking out, that emulsion tube. And we can in this case, so we have assembled it correctly. Alrighty then. The next step that we're going to do is we're simply going to install this little Phillips screw. Again, we don't have to force anything down. You want to be careful getting things started. Nothing was in super tight, you just don't want it to be loose. Flip the carburetor upside down again. We will then take our float, we'll hold it in this orientation. We'll install the float valve. Hopefully you can see exactly how we did that. We will then turn the float to this orientation and bring the carburetor up to the float. That makes sure that the float valve is still secured into the float. We'll then install the pin, and we should note that the float is functional and it only goes to that horizontal position while it's actuating the float valve. If that is not happening, and you can pull the float down further than this, you have not installed the float valve correctly. Go back, try again. There's no drain on this float bowl, so we can put it on in any position that we want. If you do have a drain, it sits on the engine, the carburetor sits on the engine like this, you would want your float bowl drain to be facing in this direction or facing forward on the engine, just so you could actually access the bolt, but that's not applicable in this example. We'll go ahead and tighten, and if you do this kind of finger tight, you should be able to feel resistance on that float bowl with the bolt finger tight. If it's tightening up, being the bolt is tightening up and you can still easily turn the float bowl, you don't have the main jet threaded in far enough. If you tighten that down without the main jet installed correctly, you're going to pull the threads and then you're going to destroy the carburetor. So that's pretty much what there is to the carburetor disassembly and reassembly. This has been a look at how to disassemble and reassemble the carburetor on your typical Honda GC series engine.